The wind whistled across the barren plains, carrying with it the dry scent of sagebrush and dust, the kind of air that clung to your clothes and settled into your bones, making every breath taste like the land itself, raw and unforgiving. And into this vast silence rode a young woman named Clara, her hat pulled low, her face hidden beneath the shadow of a brim that had seen better days, her hands tightly gripping the reins of the mule she guided across the uneven ground, each hoofstep falling like a lonely echo in the emptiness. Clara was tired, tired in the way that seeped beyond the skin and into the spirit, tired of endless days of chores, tired of nights filled with silence, so thick it felt like a second, kind of loneliness pressing on her chest, and most of all, tired of pretending that she could build a life alone out here where even the strongest men often failed. She had lost her father 2 winters back, the fever taking him quickly, and her mother had passed when she was still just a child, leaving Clara with only memories of lullabies hummed against a backdrop of rattling windows and prairie storms. For 2 years she tried to keep the homestead alive, patching fences, planting corn, hauling water, working from sunup until the moon shone cold and silver in the sky. But each day the land seemed to push back harder, as though it knew she was just one woman against the wilderness. And so one morning, with tears she refused to let fall, she saddled the mule, packed what little she had into a burlap sack, and whispered to the empty house that had once been her home, "I can't do this anymore. I'm tired of living without someone beside me." And with those words, she turned her back on everything she had built and started toward town, toward something unknown, toward a hope she hardly dared to name. The town of Dry Creek wasn't much to look at, just a stretch of weathered buildings baking in the sun. The saloon with its squeaky swinging doors, the blacksmith's forge hammering steel into life, the general store smelling of tobacco and coffee grounds. But to Clara it was like walking into another world, one filled with voices and laughter, the clop of hooves, the jangle of spurs, the sight of faces, strangers, yes, but faces nonetheless, not the empty windows of her lonely farm. She stood for a long time by the well, drinking deeply from the cool water, her eyes darting from person to person, until finally she spotted him, a man standing tall near the hitching post, one hand resting on the neck of his horse, the other adjusting his hat as though it were second nature, and everything about him spoke of quiet strength. His name was Daniel McGraw, though most folks called him Dan the Rancher, for his spread stretched wider than the eye could see, cattle grazing like dark specks against the horizon. Clara didn't know his name then, but something in the way he carried himself caught her attention, not boastful or loud like so many of the cowboys leaning against the saloon rails, but steady, deliberate, like a man who knew both loss and labor yet still chose to stand upright against the world. Clara's heart beat faster without her permission, and she found herself stepping forward, her voice catching in her throat before she even reached him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her words almost carried away by the wind, but he heard, turning to meet her eyes with a look both sharp and kind, like sunlight cutting through storm clouds. I need work, or help, or maybe both." She hadn't meant to spill so much in so few words, but once spoken, they could not be taken back, and the silence that followed made her want to shrink into the dust. Yet Daniel only studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly, his gaze lingering not with judgment, but with a quiet understanding. "Life's not easy out here," he said, his voice deep, carrying the weight of long days under the sun. "But if you're willing to work, I might have room at the ranch for another pair of hands." Clara nearly collapsed with relief, though her pride stiffened her back, and she nodded, trying to keep her voice steady as she replied, "I'll work harder than anyone you've got. I just can't go back to living alone." The confession slipped from her lips like a secret, but Daniel didn't flinch, didn't mock her for her honesty. Instead, something softened in his eyes, and he gestured toward his horse. "Come on then, let's get you home." The ride out to his ranch was long, the sun dipping low in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and fire, and Clara found herself glancing at Daniel again and again, trying to read the story written in the lines of his face. He looked like a man who had weathered storms both inside and out, his jaw firm, his eyes scanning the horizon as though he expected trouble at every turn. Yet there was also a quiet protectiveness in the way he slowed his horse's pace to match her mule, as if silently promising she would not be left behind. When at last the ranch came into view, Clara's breath caught. Rolling hills dotted with cattle, barns standing tall, and a homestead larger than anything she had ever called her own. It was not wealth in the sense of gold or jewels, but it was richness born of sweat and soil, of years poured into building something that could last. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt a flicker of hope stir within her chest. That night, after a supper of beans, cornbread, and fresh milk, she sat on the porch beside Daniel, the stars glittering overhead in a sky so wide it seemed to swallow them whole, and she whispered almost to herself, "I thought I'd die out there alone on that farm. I thought maybe that's all life had left for me." Daniel didn't answer right away, just leaned back in his chair, staring at the stars, before finally saying, "Out here, it's easy to think the land wants to break you. But sometimes, if you hold on long enough, you find the land gives back. Maybe that's what you are meant for, not giving up, but finding where you belong." Clara turned to look at him then, her heart pounding, and in that moment she knew that whatever came next, whether heartache or happiness, this man, this rancher, would be part of her story. And dear listener, if you've been riding along with Clara this far, if you felt the loneliness in her voice and the quiet strength in Daniel's, then don't stop here. Subscribe to this channel, because the story is only just beginning, and the next chapter will take you deeper into the trials, the dangers, and the love that can only be born in the Wild West.